Ah, All right, thank you for joining us this evening. This is number 12, our 1 year anniversary of the pop-up speaker series, and we have a treat for you this evening. We have Dr. Kate Morales will be joining us. Kate is an industrial organizational psychologist and a defense program director. Boy, does that sound fancy? Who her work sits at the intersection of human systems, performance, and organizational design. Drawing on her experience leading technical teams in high stakes defense environments, she focuses on translating complex human variability, particularly neurodiversity, into practical strategies for leadership, culture, and workforce development. And through her consulting practice, Ever Evolve, she helps organizations move from performative inclusion to measurable behavioral and structural change and works with business leaders to drive their organizations with clarity, curiosity, courage, and compassion. Today, she'll be sharing insights on neurodiversity in the workplace, challenging us to rethink the way we define and cultivate human potential. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Morales. Kate, please take it away.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for your time here. So I want to start with just a little bit of an introduction. Again, my name is Kate Morales, organizational leadership consultant, United States Air Force veteran. I am diagnosed autistic, so I'm a part of that neurodivergent community that I'll be talking about today. And just to prove it to you, I love dinosaurs. I'm a big dinosaur fan. So thank you so much for joining me. You'll hear me say things like neuroinclusion, cognitive diversity, things like that, and I'll do my best to explain the terms as we go. I've been studying this topic for several years, culminating with the completion of my doctoral dissertation on the workplace experiences of people with executive dysfunction. And I'm really excited to share with you some of the things I've learned and how we can improve our workplaces by both embracing and accommodating different needs. With that said, I have some agenda items here. So I'll cover what is cognitive diversity, talk about that from the beginning, go a little bit into the neuroscience of neurodiversity, talk about what we see often in terms of challenges and strengths in neurodivergent people. I'll talk through my specific study results from my dissertation and what I learned through that process. And then I'll finish up with some do's and don'ts of how to empower neurodivergent teammates, whether you work with them, whether they work for you, however you interact with them. And these are things that really cater to concepts of universal design and making things accessible to everyone in a way that they can interact with successfully. So, what is cognitive diversity or what is neurodivergent? This is having a style of neurocognitive functioning that diverges from the dominant societal standards of normal. Neurodivergent people include those with conditions such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, autistics, dyscalculics, OCD, Tourette's, and several others that you can see there. This is not an exhaustive list. And one thing that I like to bring up is that neurodiversity is something that can be acquired. So it can result as a result of illness, brain injury, trauma, social systems, expectations, and it really impacts socialization, learning, task performance, attention, mood regulation, kind of all the ways we interact socially with other people. There are physical, chemical, hormonal differences in how the brain and other body systems work. So this isn't, merely, I say merely in quotes, a mental thing. This is actual differences in the way the brain functions, the hormones that are created, the chemicals that react. And social systems are really the barrier here. The expectations of social interactions are what create barriers for neurodivergent people. And so by facing that, looking at the way we expect people to interact with each other, we can remove a lot of those barriers and we can make things easier on our colleagues and often on ourselves as well. So, some quick facts about neurodiversity. Approximately 15 to 20% of the population has a neurological difference. So that ends up being about 1 in 5 people. However, it's estimated that only half of people with neurodivergent conditions are diagnosed. It is really difficult to get a diagnosis, and we can talk about that later if you like. It's also very common for neurodivergent people to have overlapping neurodifferences. So, for example, someone with a primary assessment for dyslexia is highly likely to additionally have other neurodifferences such as neurodyspraxia or ADHD, things like that. A lot of neurodivergent people have been trained to see their neurodivergent tendencies as personality aspects. And so a lot of the things that neurodivergent people struggle with, like things like, time management or attention, things like that, can often be blamed on, laziness or lack of discipline or things like that. Men and boys are about 4 times more likely to be diagnosed than women, and neurodivergent women are more likely to be misdiagnosed with personality disorders first. I, in fact, many neurodivergent women are often misdiagnosed with things like bipolar or borderline personality disorder. And on average, neurodivergent women get 3 other diagnoses before they ever get a neurodivergent diagnosis. Women aren't the only group that experiences this. Cultural and minority identities can really complicate things. And sometimes even just some things that you would expect in society can complicate diagnosis. And one example that I love to give for this is one of the major diagnostic criteria for autism is avoiding eye contact. However, that's like only a diagnostic criterion because we come from a culture that values eye contact. If you come from a society with a more hierarchical power structure that de-emphasizes eye contact between individuals, somebody in that culture might not present with that particular symptom. And so, it could be a misdiagnosis, etc. Statistically speaking, the farther away you get from the typical Western educated, industrial, rich, and democratic demographic, the harder it is to get a diagnosis. It's also important, as I mentioned before, that neurodivergent conditions can be acquired. And no, that doesn't mean that vaccines cause autism. It means that neurodiversity can be acquired through brain injury, illness, trauma, and lots of other factors that aren't easily understood. And finally, neurodivergent adults are more likely than average to be non-religious, to be LGBTQIA+, to have other chronic illnesses or ongoing physical and mental health issues, and they generally operate on the edge of burnout. There's not really a clear benchmark to guide employers about what they should be doing to better support neurodiverse staff. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to focus in on this topic and look at the practical applications. So I'll go through this quickly. It's a very complicated set of pathways, but I want to talk a little bit about the neuroscience here because I think it's important context for you to understand what's going on with neurodivergent people. So in general, neurodivergent people have differences in the production and transmission of dopamine. And these differences can involve variations in brain structure, chemistry, how the neural networks are organized, how they communicate with each other. Excuse me. Trying to scroll in my notes and I scrolled the slides. Studies show that neurodivergent brains can have measurably different structures and activity patterns compared to neurotypical brains, and they show differences in up to 7 different areas of the brain. Certain areas of the brain show activity and response to stimuli, including those involved in goal-directed action, learning, reward processing, memory formation, etc. And these neurological differences impact aspects of functioning, socialization, learning, task performance, attention, mood regulation, sensory processing, communication, etc. So to give an example of this, I just want to give the context of what is happening in a neurotypical brain. So hopefully, if I turn on my, wait a second, I was trying to turn on my little laser pointer. There we go. Okay. So this yellow pathway here is the nigrostriatal pathway. And then the other one that I talk about the most is the mesocortical pathway. So that's this blue one. So the nigrostriatal pathway is a circuit from the center of the brain to the other areas that control motor function and learning capabilities. And incidentally, this is why we see learning so heavily impacted by movement. And so, you might have heard that if you're like doing an activity, moving while you learn, it sticks better, and that is why, because of this pathway that controls both of those things. And then the mesocortical limbic pathway is another circuit from the central glands of the brain back to the prefrontal cortex and the frontal cortex, and that deals with reward, motivation, motor neuron regulation, etc. Dopamine is the most common reference neurotransmitter when it comes to neurocognition. It functions as an escort molecule that converts thought into action. So in our neural synapses, what's happening, all action that you're taking is a result of dopamine production and regulation. Neurodivergent people have differences in the production and the transmission of dopamine, which means that they can have deficits in social interaction, communication, patterns of behavior, motivating action. The release of dopamine in your brain is what makes you feel alert, focused, motivated, happy. And so it's easy to see how someone that doesn't have enough dopamine anywhere along these pathways, that would impact their actions, and vice versa. Overproduction of dopamine could then spawn obsessive, hyper-focused, manic behavior, those types of things. So if you look at the picture on the top right there, you can see a comparison of a neurotypical brain on the left with an ADHD brain on the right. And that area of the brain that is lit up on the left is the cortex, which controls motor functions, sensory interpretations, and emotional reactions. And you can see on the brain on the right that it is not as active and it has different responses to stimuli. Studies have shown that 5 of the 7 areas of the brain indicated here are different in people with ADHD. These I won't go through all of the different areas of the brain, but it's the hippocampus, the putamen, the caudate nucleus, and some others. Although there's not really anything necessarily wrong with being different in this way, the way our society and work culture are organized does create difficulties with how some of us work and stay motivated. An important thing to note is that all cognitive differences are on a spectrum. Each person is going to have unique, changing needs, strengths, and challenges. And additionally, depending on the external environment, the level of effort in a task, and many of the internal brain chemistry components, every day can be different. So for example, with autism, I have days where I can operate with lots of background noise, lots going on, plenty of interruptions. And then there are other days where I just can't focus unless I have total quiet. And a quick anecdote here, when I was in my early 20s, I actually went to a hearing doctor because I was concerned that when I was going to networking events or parties or going out to restaurants, I couldn't hear people when they were talking. And I worked in a retail store at the time where there are a lot of busy days, lots of commotion, the music's loud, the AC is on. I'm standing right next to someone looking them in the face, and I still cannot hear what they are saying. The hearing doctor checked my hearing and told me there's nothing wrong with your hearing. You just need to learn to listen better. What I know today is that I have auditory processing difficulties. So my brain can't zone in on one sound and tune others out. So I hear everything with equal importance. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with my hearing, but there's something different about the way my brain processes those signals. And that doesn't just apply to sound. For neurodivergent people, that can apply across senses. So it could be something as simple as the tag on your shirt poking you, lots of sensory sensitivities, which I will be talking about shortly. So I want to talk about some of the challenges that neurodivergent people bring or face in the workplace. One very common issue is with decoding information. So this can pop up as poor reading comprehension. It might show up as poor listening skills. The social aspect of decoding, such as understanding nuance, reacting to people's facial expressions, body language, tone, their specific words. This is an issue for me personally. I have a lot of issues with that. And the example that I love to give is when I worked in retail, people at the end of the night would say, "Hey, a bunch of us are going out to this bar after work." And my brain interpreted that and would hear, "Okay, that's interesting information. Thank you for letting me know that." Not realizing that that implied an invitation to go with them. And so I, had this social difficulty with them where they thought that I was being aloof and, turning them down. And then the next day, people would come and say, "Hey, we missed you last night." And I would say, "Oh, I wasn't invited." And they, they'd give me a funny look because they didn't explicitly say, "We would like you to join us." And my brain didn't catch the implication. Yeah, Rihanna and I see what you're saying. We're like vampires. You need to invite us in explicitly. That is accurate. Moving on, executive dysfunction is one of the most impactful challenges, and this is the one I honed in on in my dissertation. Executive function normally deals with how you plan tasks, organize work, initiate, manage distractions, and what I call actually doing the thing. Cognitively divergent people have a plethora of issues with this. One of the most common is what we call ADHD paralysis or task paralysis. This is when you know you need to do something and you want to do the thing, but you cannot get your body to actually do it. And this might have to do with being overwhelmed at the magnitude of tasks, getting caught up in the details, not knowing where to start. And that can be really debilitating. It can look like laziness or procrastination, but it's not. It's related to motivation, which I'll get to in a moment here. Next is multitasking. So this comes in the form of having trouble following a bunch of directions back to back without referencing back to the instructions. So one of the things I learned in my dissertation study with the people I interviewed was that they said, if you're giving me a bunch of instructions, like verbally, I'm not going to remember them at all. I need to have them written down, or that it's just gone. It's gone forever. That has to do with multitasking. It has to do with a part of the brain that we call working memory. This can also cause issues with keeping track of lots of things or having different details in your memory at the same time. Lack of interest is a little bit of a joke in the neurodivergent community. We like to say that we have two types of interest, and that is utterly obsessed or I literally could not care less about this. So it's like an on or an off switch. There's no in between. And the effect is that if a topic doesn't hit that utterly obsessed level, then we have a ton of difficulty motivating ourselves to focus on it or continue the task. And that can manifest in more ways than just tasks as well. We also have issues changing tasks, and there's a very methodical way in which human brains switch tasks. And basically, your brain needs to follow a process of stop one task, switch, start the next task. It's kind of like the change model that we learn about, where it's like stop doing the old thing, you know, switch, and then start doing the new thing. Um, if there's not enough time given for that switch to happen, then neurodivergent people can get stuck. Um, this shows up in meetings. This shows up when we need to process lots of information quickly. And give me a second here. There we go. Back at my notes. For example, if someone is talking and they say, any questions? All right, good, moving on. They don't allow enough time for a pause. Your brain is not going to catch up with that. You're going to have trouble, leaving that topic and moving on to the next one. And then 10 minutes from now, if you do that to me, I'm going to have a question that references back to that topic, because that's how long it took my brain to process that. I didn't have time to switch topics. And actually, Jeremy talks about this a lot in his, if you've listened to the Work Cookie podcast, he talks about the 6-second rule. And that is backed up by science, that it takes about 6 seconds for you to hear a question, process it, and be able to respond. And in the same way, he uses it as an example of getting people to say more, because it starts getting uncomfortable after about that 6 seconds. But it really does take that long. We also tend to be very sensitive in terms of sensory inputs. We can have trouble with sensory regulation, which I alluded to earlier, and this might show up as being distractible. Your brain can't tune out the less important thing in order to focus on the more important thing. Motivation is another one. We struggle a lot with motivation or lack of motivation. One thing that commonly happens is that once a task reaches about 70% complete, the interest switch flips off and you can't bring yourself to finishing it. So if you have a dozen hobbies that you started and didn't finish, that might sound familiar to you. Or if you're constantly starting a new project and then it gets 70% of the way done and then you leave it, that's an issue with motivation. In neurodivergent people, our brains don't produce enough dopamine. And so what happens is we tend to be starved for dopamine, and we will go chasing it anywhere except where we need it to be. And this can happen a lot of times with, like, if you have to work on an assignment and suddenly you are very motivated to clean your house. I like to joke that when I was working on my master's thesis, my house was never as clean as when I was doing that. And that's just because your brain decides it's going to get the dopamine from that thing instead of the thing that you want to do. And so you put the actual product on the back burner until the time pressure creates enough motivation that it generates the dopamine that will enable us to be able to do that. Finally, time management. This is really common, especially in ADHD, dyslexia, and dyscalculia. We see a huge difficulty in time management and time perception. We call that time blindness. So we have trouble estimating how long tasks should take, managing our time, doing different tasks, losing track of the flow of time, and can often be perpetually late. Or sometimes we overcompensate for this and we end up being way too early for things just to avoid being late. So I notably will show up to things like an hour early just because I don't want to be late. And yeah, exhaustion can exacerbate that very much. So that's the struggles. But I also want to talk about some of the strengths because neurodivergent people bring a lot to the table. I've broken these up into 6 categories that address different aspects of work because I want it to apply specifically to work. So, first, observation and analysis. Neurodivergent people tend to be really good at research, fact finding, spotting patterns. We take an analytical and methodical approach to problem solving. We have really good detail orientation, and we can be very precise and thorough. Memory and retention. We have excellent long term recall. Um, I'm very, very good at trivia, for example, because I have information that just sticks in my brain forever. But I don't necessarily have control of what sticks. So sometimes I feel like I have information that's useless that's taking up room in places where I could be using it for something better. And um, I'm sure you can identify with that. Uh, Deep focus is another thing. When you get a neurodivergent person focused on something, they can be relentless. We have immense concentration on a task and a somewhat uncanny ability to tune everything else out if it hits that hyperfocus switch on us. Um, we also, as a factor of how our brains work, tend to over organize things. So we have methodical approaches to things, we're analytical, we pick up patterns that are not that obvious. We have non standard approaches to projects and tasks. Um, our thought processes literally wire connections differently in our brains. So our brains will make connections that bypass the areas that don't function as actively. So literally the physical process of thought is different in a neurodivergent person than in a neurotypical person. And so neurodivergent people can be known to come up with unique and innovative solutions that others might not have thought of. We tend to be really visual. We can remember things we see or recall an image in our mind really well, which relates back to that detail orientation. We have special interests, which means that we have a kind of an ability to become an expert in something very quickly. And it's because of that hyper focus switch that gets turned on. So it can lead us into heavily researching a topic or learning something in depth, becoming highly competent at a certain skill set in a very brief period of time because all of our energy goes into that. And that can also generate a lot of creativity because we have novel approaches to things. We have active imaginations. We can picture scenarios easily, and we can often express our ideas in ways that are unique. We tend to be very accepting of differences. And this probably comes from the fact that many of us feel different in our own world. So there's a good bit of empathy and compassion for others that comes out of that. We challenge norms when they don't work for everyone. And we tend to be very honest and loyal, specifically autistic people, but it does cross the realm of different neurodiversities, have a very tough time with dishonesty or less than complete honesty. Being deceptive does not come easily. Integrity shows up in our dedication to following the rules. And because of the way our brains work, a well formulated set of rules and guidelines is a beautiful thing because it's something we can fall back on and check that we're on track or we're doing things right. But badly written or poorly defined rules are a nemesis. We'll often straight up ignore rules when we don't understand why they are in place. And so, in terms of application, it's really important to give us reasons for making decisions whenever you can. Like I said, I was in the Air Force, and a lot of times in the military, you'll hear because the commander said so, and that's the reason. And that's fine, and we can learn to deal with those things. but in general, you're going to get much better compliance and enthusiasm when we believe in the idea behind the rules. That does mean that we sometimes get in trouble for challenging or questioning authority, and a lot of times we're not trying to be combative, we're just trying to get to the reason behind the rules. So, big picture, several of the strengths that cognitively divergent people bring to the table. You have a focused, tenacious, creative person who can achieve competency in a skill set very quickly. Sounds like a dream employee. But then when you put in those challenges, you can see how that can create some friction in the workplace. So with that said, I want to quickly go through my research and what I learned through my interviews. So I conducted a qualitative study. It was reliant on interviews that I conducted virtually. I allowed for open conversation, exposition of narratives and experiences, and I interviewed each person for about 60 to 90 minutes, focusing on a typical workday through the different elements of executive function. And then when I coded that, these are the topics that emerged as the most common. So three main categories, and that is working memory, inhibition control, and cognitive flexibility. And I focused on accommodations and challenges in each of those. And then other things that came up pretty often, topics like taking breaks, changing your mindset, externalization, email, location preferences are other topics that came up. But I will be talking about these things in reference to these top three categories here. So in terms of working memory, three major themes that came up: information retention, organization struggles, and visual aids. Every single one of my interviewees said, hey, if someone's info dumping on me, I either have to write everything down or I'll lose it. And one of them even said, if there's a long email thread with multiple people, I just assume that information is gone forever because I won't be able to retain it. Struggling organizationally, if you have a messy space, it often reflects the state of your mind. And so we tend to struggle very heavily with either staying organized, or we will over organize things just to try to keep it manageable. And then the use of visual aids. Every single one of the people I interviewed mentioned using visual aids to remind them to do things. And this might come in the sense of like putting a sticky note or something. But I really liked this particular one because it also includes externalization. So this particular person works in a research laboratory, and he told me that he needs to put his consent forms in a locked cabinet before he leaves. And so he will literally put his keys underneath the consent forms so that he can't get to the keys until he's put the consent forms away. And so that's how he kind of manages that in his mind. In terms of inhibition control, three topics that came up are task initiation, interruptions and distractions, and emotional responses. One of my folks who works in a legal office said that she had to keep getting talked to about missing deadlines because simply starting a task was so difficult for her. And so she has to add time in, and other folks told me this as well, to your estimate of how long something's going to take. You have to add in that start paralysis at the beginning, and that may or may not be a correct estimation of how long that takes. Interruptions and distractions. One of my folks said she really has a hard time with instant messages, with people coming to talk to her in person. So she was in an in-person office before. And so people would stop by and say, hey, can I ask you a quick question? Can I just chat with you? They'd call her on the phone. And that was really difficult for her. And so she asked them to communicate with her via email or instant message so that she could control when she could engage in those things. And so she would have a particular time of the day where she would go and look at emails and respond to them and things like that, and then be able to get back to her deep focus work. In terms of interruptions and distractions, I asked my folks what kinds of emotions they went through as they experienced this. And the number one term that came up was frustration. We also heard exhaustion, tiredness, overwhelm, annoyance, anxiety. So we really have strong emotional reactions to um, distractions and interruptions in our space. And so by being able to minimize those, it can really, even out our emotional stability because it's not putting that strain on it. And that can be a really big challenge. And then finally, I can get this to go. There we go. Um, Cognitive flexibility. Unexpected transitions was a really important one with the folks I interviewed. So, one of them said if an urgent request comes in, and she has to switch tasks to face this urgent request, it takes her a good bit of time to switch back to what she was doing before. Um, Extended transition times, again, uh, bringing a task to a logical stopping point before switching to a new one is really important because that helps our folks maintain a sense of completion, avoid losing their train of thought, and then it also makes it easier to re-engage it later because you aren't picking it up in the middle of a thought process that you can't remember anymore. And then finally, structured routines were really important. One of my guys mentioned that if he wakes up in an unfamiliar place, it's really difficult for him. And he doesn't have the same established routine for starting his day. And so if he does, like, let's say he spends the night at a friend's house, he will sometimes go home to restart his day, even if it's at the expense of being late to work, because the routine is so important to him. And so that routine and keeping things in a familiar pattern is really important for folks as well. So, overall, common themes. A lot of these folks found their own accommodations to offset the negative effects of executive dysfunction. Um, One thing that was clear across all of them is that information delivery method matters. They all said that they preferred to have information delivered in multiple ways in order for it to be retained. So they want something in writing and they want to be able to talk to somebody about it. They want to be able to ask questions about it, those types of things, but they also want something that they can refer back to. Creative physical reminders are helpful with them. So whether that's, the keys under the consent forms, colorful sticky notes, different types of things, those types of visual stimuli are really important. Task estimation is going to be a challenge. So, asking them how long something's going to take may or may not include the amount of time that it takes to get started. And getting started is really the hardest part of any activity. And they all kind of gave me this feedback that just getting over that hump of getting started is really a difficult uh, hurdle for them to get over. Distractions can sometimes take hours to recover from, and that can be true across the board. I had one person who told me that um, she had a fire what do you call it? Um, Fire alarm go off at work. And so they had to evacuate the building and then they came back and stuff. And she actually was unable to work for the entire rest of the day because that was such a big distraction into her day. So now she asks that if there's going to be, a fire drill or something, if they can give her a heads up so that either she can prepare for it or she can work from home that day because that protects her ability to, keep going, keep doing things. Um, Resets are really important. All my folks talked about the ability to get up change your visual environment in order to switch mental modes, and those mental modes are what they use to navigate contexts. So switching from, work mode to home mode, or, all of my folks worked from home to some extent. And so switching from that kind of I'm in my work zone now to I'm my at home self right now was really important, or switching from a meeting mode to a deep focus work type mode, those types of things. Those mindsets are really important. And so those visual resets can make a huge difference. And so getting somebody up and changing their visual environment can really impact that. Some implications of this. There we go. There's really no one right way to do things. Different manifestations, like I said, everybody's on a spectrum, so different manifestations require different modifications. Um, some people might need to be in an office where they can close the door. Other people might do fine with headphones. It just depends on the individual's needs. Executive dysfunction specifically manifests uniquely in each person, but as we saw, there are plenty of commonalities. Individual experiences can illuminate useful accommodations across the board. And one thing I found was that many accommodations that people use are simple to implement and require little to no resources. So it's literally something as simple as letting someone take a 5-minute break between things, or allowing them to use headphones to either play sound or drown out the sound around them, etc. That doesn't, necessarily cost the company anything, but it makes all the difference for an individual. So I'm going to go into talking about some do's and don'ts. These are general rules. I find that these tips generally work for everyone that we work with, regardless of their neurodivergent status. Everybody benefits from these types of considerations. So, first, be willing to be flexible, even if you don't have any neurodivergent people. Not everybody works at the same pace or the same rhythm, and some of us are more energetic in the morning. Some don't hit stride till after lunch. Some get up super early, and others will stay till 3 in the morning working on a project. It just depends. So, be willing to be flexible as much as you can with your folks. Be patient with them. The repetitive actions that we do sometimes to self-soothe in stressful situations, like clicking a pen or tapping on a table or something, um, might be annoying to you, but a lot of times they're necessary, and they're what is holding back, an emotional dysregulatory event. So it doesn't mean necessarily that we should be allowed to be disruptive, and helping folks find other ways to manage those repetitive motions to stim, like if pen clicking is a bother, maybe get the person a fidget ring or something that's going to be quieter that they can play with. And there's a lot of fidgets that are out there right now, that allow for that. Give us time to process. Um, we're not great at holding a lot of information in our heads at the same time, so we need to be able to switch between tasks or be ready to answer questions, and that requires a lot of patience from folks. Um, I often say, when somebody asks me, "Do you have any questions?" I will say, "Not at the moment, but I reserve the right to have questions later, because I know that about 2 hours from now, something's gonna come up in my head, and I'm gonna wanna revisit that." Um, Next, accommodate wherever you can. For most neurodivergent people, accommodations are pretty simple, like having a quiet workspace where they won't be interrupted, using headphones, etc., allowing them to use music, etc. The 6-second rule, like I mentioned, is really valuable because it allows a little bit extra time to process, and that works for everybody as well. It also is an interesting kind of psychological tool to use to get people to say more, because they start getting uncomfortable after about 6 seconds of silence. Using Clear communication, avoiding parables, metaphors, things like that. Don't suggest things that are not requests. You'll see that in my don'ts. We really appreciate directness. If you need me to do something, you got to tell me to do it. If you say, "Hey, the trash needs to be taken out," I'm gonna say, "Yeah, it does. It's pretty stinky." Um, I'm not gonna necessarily, sorry about that, realize that you're asking me to do it. So say, "Hey, will you please take the trash out?" It's that simple. And I understand that, like, for a lot of people, directness like that can be uncomfortable, but it really is important and helpful for a lot of people. Providing read aheads are also really important. Giving people actionable feedback, um, considering someone's environment when you're assessing individual performance. So, not just how is this person performing, but are they in an environment that allows them to perform well? Um, and then leading with compassion. Like I mentioned, be flexible, be patient, make sure you know not everybody knows what their struggles are. American communication patterns can be very nuanced. It's going to take some practice to get used to being clear. Um, and you might want to have a tendency to treat everyone the same, but it really helps to hold people to their own standards rather than try to have one across the board. I've had managers that were really bothered when everyone wasn't looking at them, but for some people, making eye contact is a distractor and prevents us from being able to listen. So I listen much better when I'm not looking directly at someone. And if you force me to look into your eyes, it can be really counterproductive to your goals. It's going to be harder for me to pay attention when you're forcing me to conduct eye contact. We also all have waves of productivity, so just be aware that folks give them leeway as to how they fulfill your expectations. Um, I find the Pomodoro technique really useful. That's that time schedule where you work on something for 25 minutes, you take a 5-minute break, and you do that for a few times, and then you take a longer break. Um, there are other methods and ways of managing time, but that one is particularly useful for me. Um, and then I want to move on to the don'ts. Don't phrase directions as questions. And this is really important. So, like I said a minute ago, like um, uh, asking someone or suggesting that something needs to happen isn't the same as telling them that it needs to be done. So, don't say, "How do you feel about doing this?" Say, "I need you to do this." It's much easier to understand for folks. Don't demand a standard of attentiveness or work productivity, like that eye contact. Make your expectations clear, but make sure that that person agrees to them and understands that they're reasonable. Don't give ambiguous or unclear directions. Make sure you're explicit. Have people say things back to you to make sure they understand them and that things are as you expect. And then don't interpret questions or challenges as disrespect. Oftentimes, we will ask a lot of questions because we're trying to understand the nuance and uh, get all the information we need to be able to engage. And so that can be taken as a challenge, but it really is more just a sign of engagement more than anything. Um, don't insinuate or speak with nuanced meanings or get frustrated at unrelated questions. I promise they're not unrelated. At some point, they're making a connection in that person's brain that's going to help them to retain that information. And so, um, the more we can operate from a place of compassion, curiosity, and offering people dignity and the accommodations that we need, the better results we'll get out of people. You'll have happier people working with you. And, um, you know, if anybody remembers the old California cheese commercial from the 90s, great cheese comes from happy cows, right? So the 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 better your people feel taken care of, the more they're going to produce and create a healthier work culture together as well. So with that said, that is the end of my presentation. I really appreciate you all attending. I'll take questions. I know there's been a lot of chatter in the comments, so I'll take a look at those. My contact information is here on the screen for you. Feel free to scan that QR from my LinkedIn. And yeah, so I don't know, Pam or Arlene, if either one of you want to call out any specific questions, or we can just
No, there's just a lot of
chatter.
comments and agreements,
Yes.
shall we say, in the comments. But I did have one question that I wrote down is more or less from your research perspective. With the chart that you showed, the emotional responses, could you go a little bit more into what was the basis for the frustration emotional response? Was that more or less the frustration of, oh, I'm being interrupted again, or was there something more to it, more depth to what that frustration meant to them?
Yeah, so it has a lot to do with the amount of time that it takes to get back to what you were doing before. And so it's not just, oh, I'm being interrupted again. It's that every time you get interrupted, it's going to take longer to get back to what you were doing. And so I had one person that I interviewed who works in a law office, and she said there are certain days at the end of the month where like certain briefs have to be done. And so she has a lot of people coming to her and asking her questions and things like that. And on those days, she won't schedule any other work. So her plan is to be distracted all day because she knows she won't be able to get anything else done. But if that happens and you're not expecting it, you haven't planned for it, then that can be incredibly frustrating because every time you try to go back to what you were doing or to switch tasks, it's that much more difficult.
Okay. Thanks for that.
You don't like Pomodoro?
No, yeah, because it can take me 15, 20 minutes to get into the jive and then to stop 10 minutes later. Yep, nope.
Yeah. And that's great that, some people find that they need, at least an hour or an hour and a half or something like that. So whatever that person needs, it's really about getting to know the people that you work with and what they need and their requirements. Yeah. Any other questions?
So I have another one, and I'm kind of pinging some of my questions to kind of give others time to contemplate their questions. You guys can throw them in the chat or raise your hand or whatever. But I'm also curious, when you were, and I don't know if this was part of your interview questions or if there were comments that kind of could lead to part of this answer, but what was their interaction with their supervisor or their manager when it came to meeting their needs, whether they actually asked for formal accommodations or not? What was that support like from their manager?
Yeah, so the folks that I interviewed, so because it was a dissertation project, I wasn't allowed to focus on any particular diagnosis.
Correct.
And a lot of times having a formal diagnosis is a requirement of getting accommodations from an employer. That's just how a lot of our employment law works. So a lot of these folks did not have any kind of diagnosis. Some of them did, but most of them did not. And so they had to learn to advocate for themselves in ways that worked around that disability accommodation process.
Okay.
Many of them needed to just say something like, this is just the style that I have, that I work with, or this is what I need in order to be productive or to get things done. And so they would use that kind of language where it sort of personalizes it,
Yeah.
without, disclosing like, hey, I have
Mhm.
ADHD or something like that.
Yeah.
In general, that is how they interacted, and some of them had kind of combative relationships with their supervisors, who didn't, if they didn't understand those needs, or they expected something different, and so they had, found ways to work around that as well. But for the most part, it was really about this is what I need in order to be
Mhm.
successful, and advocating for themselves in that way.
Okay. Interesting. Curious. What else for questions? Anybody else? Because I could go on and on and on, Kate. So I will I will reserve more for later. One thing I will mention, Kate, and especially with the comment that Rhiannon put into the chat, the support without needing to disclose with my students. I'm an adjunct instructor, and so I would um, put it out there, phrase it in a particular way that if you guys running into challenges, whatever it is, knowing that some people, even if they have that formal diagnosis, do not want to ask for accommodations, even
Mm-hmm.
from a school perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
so I would have that in the back of my brain, knowing that some of these students either don't want to take the time, it's just too much. And so I would simply ask everybody, if you're running into challenges, whatever, you need an extra day to turn in an assignment or something like that, just let me know, and I won't assign late points, or hey, if you need something else because you're running into challenges, let me know, and I'll help you, knowing that some people may not even know how their brain is wired, but they know that it takes them 2 days to write a couple of pages rather than maybe a day for,
Yeah.
whoever else. So I
Yeah.
try and incorporate that.
And that's a really good approach, because for a couple of different reasons. One is that a lot of folks have internalized their differences, and so they
Mhm.
think, oh,
Yes.
I'm just a procrastinator, or I'm just lazy, or I just can't focus, or whatever it is. And so putting it out there and normalizing it is a really important element to giving them permission to realize that this is something that they can ask for help with, and not just something that they have to struggle with. The other thing is that having a handful, just a few examples of accommodations that you're willing to give, can
Yep.
often open up and say, like you said, if you need an extra day, or if you don't understand and you want to have a one-on-one to go over this assignment, or things like that, um, is that will give folks the ideas to ask for the things that they need. And when I was going through my PhD program, I met with the disability liaison for the school, and she actually, the way she approached it with me was, she went through and she said, do you want this accommodation, do you want this accommodation, do you want this accommodation, do you want this accommodation? And giving me those examples brought a lot of
Mhm.
things to mind that I hadn't even thought of, that I didn't even realize, like, that could be an accommodation. Oh, that's amazing, I
Mhm.
love that. Yes. Like having closed captioning turned on, or being able to turn off my camera, or things like that that were sometimes required. The it gave me the permission to say like, oh yeah, actually that would be really helpful. So having a list of things is a great place to start as well.
Yeah, because I can't really throw out some of the reasonings behind,
Yeah.
but I can provide those examples of, like you said, if you need an extra day, or if you want to make sure that you're spending enough time to turn in an assignment that you're happy with, and you want another day, you need another day, let me know,
Yeah.
because we all work at different paces. We have life. I mean, I did my schooling while working as well, so I
Mhm.
understand that balance. So I try to
Yeah. Yeah.
acknowledge without saying, that I'll work with you, just to try and get them to at least open up. Because the more I got them to open up with me one-on-one, because the school's got a really cool chat system,
Mhm.
holy smokes, and then you can just show a little bit more support.
Mhm.
And that little bit of support can just help a student so much more to just
So so
try.
much.
You're
Yeah.
like, oh, effort. Awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Any last questions? Because like I said, I can keep going with Kate nonstop. Um, so if nothing else, thank you, Kate, for presenting your dissertation work. Very cool. This is our first speaker that has talked about the neurodiversity um, theme, and I hope we end up having more. And as you build your business, Kate, and there's more that you end up implementing, shall we say, let's bring you back and kind of celebrate and demonstrate what you've been able to demonstrate to support employees in the workplace.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone who attended, all your time, all your comments and support. And I will talk to you next time in the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Kate.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And we hope you'll join us again next month for our next speaker.